Hey everybody, it's Mike Shea from slyflourish.com and twitter.com/slyflourish, here with another episode of the DM's Deep Dive. In this show, I like to get together with an industry expert and pick one particular topic in the world of D&D and dive deep in it. And today it is my great pleasure to have Wolfgang Baur on the show. Do you prefer if I call you Wolf? Is that too casual?
I don't know. It sounds too hippie to me. I like
Mr.
Wolfgang just
Mr.
fine.
Baur, Dr. Baur, what do you?
No, no, Wolfgang's fine.
Wolfgang. Oh, very good. Would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm the publisher at Cobalt Press. I've been working in the D&D world for these many years, since TSR and Dragon and Dungeon Magazine, and my world building is remarkably lots. I expanded Planescape with the first City Guide book. Up at the top of the spire, I did Al Qadim world building, and my own campaign setting of Midgard has been running now for 6 or 7 years and doing just fine. So, yeah, I'm a world builder, I'm a designer, and I'm a publisher.
That is awesome. Yeah, and you certainly put together and wrote a few essays in a book called The Kobold Guide to World Building.
Oh yeah,
I read it before, but I also read it before this one just to do a little bit of homework.
yeah, I got a bunch of industry veterans, some of my friends, people like Ed Greenwood or Jeff Grubb, and new kids who all have done world building and had something to say about it. So we had a good time putting that together. That book has been in print for about 4 years, and people keep coming back saying, I read it and I realized what I needed to do. So it lays out a bit of a framework in more detail, chapter by chapter. And on special topics like cartography, we got Jonathan Roberts in for that chapter. I'm really proud of that book. I think it won an Emmy.
Yeah, and yeah, that one, and along with Kobold's Guide to Adventure, I think adventure writing or adventure building.
There's an adventure, there's a plots and campaigns,
Mm-hmm.
possibly, and there's also one. The first one was called The Complete Guide to Game Design, and I'm like, man, why did we start with complete?
No, that's it. We're done.
Yeah, we're done. One and done.
Nope, no more questions.
So, and we've got one on game mastering and we've got one on board games. So the Kobold Guides have done really well because it's just going out to people who've done this for a living.
That is great. That's great.
Asking them.
So with every guest, I always like to start with a question that kind of grabs everybody's interests. What are your top three tips for world building?
So the top three tips, there's a whole lot of tips I could have gone with here, but I think my top three, and I'll expand on all of them as much as you like, is one of them is know what you're trying to build. So pick a theme or pick a seed or pick a tone, right? Um, because world building is such a vast field. You could go in a million different directions and waste a lot of time. So if you say, I want to build gothic horror, great. I want to build survival horror. Okay, that's different. I want to build elfy fantasy. Okay, great. But write it down and know what it is. Then my second tip is, and I've gone back and forth on this, start small. For newer world builders, especially, the urge is to do absolutely everything, right? Like the encyclopedic approach, which can be really satisfying to the deep nerd that wants to know it all. But for D&D, you need a village, right? You need Hamlet. You need something small. So start small and make sure that your themes are incorporated in that. And then the third thing is sort of a new top three tip for me. Not that I'm saying I had a bitter experience. I'm just saying that this is a good tip. Before you want to roll out a new campaign and set in a new world, make sure that the players you have in mind for that setting are on board, right? You can spend a lot of time doing world building for yourself, but if you mean to bring it to your table with your regular group of players or a new group of players, just say to everybody, okay, we've wrapped up our Cthulhu game. Next week, I'm bringing elf fantasy. You're all down with that, right? And
Yeah.
if the response is, yay, daddy, yay, elf fantasy, then I'm like, oh, good. My kids still love what I think they love. And if the response is, we're grognards and we hate elves, what are you thinking? Then you're like, I may have misjudged my audience. So just know before you do it, because otherwise the inevitable heartbreak is I have brought the wrong world to the audience.
Mhm. Mhm.
So those are my top three.
Those are great. Yeah, the start small one is interesting, and you know, I had you know, obviously read a lot of stuff that you did, but until I kind of re-reviewed the world building guide. So I had another guest on the show, Enrique Bertrand, the new
Oh
BDM,
yeah, yeah.
good friend of mine, and he talked about it. Yeah, and his whole pitch was like, you know, nobody gives a damn about your 5,000 year history, and nobody
True.
gives a damn about all the gods that you have sitting. They care about like the village you're in and the bar that they're in and the rats that are causing problems in the basement. Like that's,
Yes.
you know, that's what they care about, and that got
And
a lot of controversy.
I I think it's true though, because the character perspective
Right.
is I'm a
What's in front of
hero.
them?
I have concerns right now. Where's my next treasure chest coming from? Right.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't think it's true that no one cares about 5,000 years of backstory. I think the person who cares about that is you, the game master and world builder.
Mhm.
But your players don't until the moment when you say, oh, the reason your village is messed up is because 5,000 years ago this curse came along, right?
Right. Yeah.
And the moment you make history um, smack
Right.
upside the head, then they say, well, what happened 5,000 years ago? And all of a sudden it's like, wizard, tell us what you know in your books. Bard, do some lore, right? Suddenly they're interested in history, but not until it hits them upside the head.
Right. Right. Oh, by the way, my mom is in chat. Hi, mom. I'm
Yay!
so glad my mom's
That's great. Supportive family.
Yep.
Good.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, and that idea that like, yeah, what matters to the characters, right? What you can bring in front of the characters is what's going to matter. It could be a 5,000 year history if they're find out that the small village they're on is sitting on the ruins of a 5,000-year-old destroyed magocracy.
Oh, that's awesome.
Now I got
Yes.
something to explore, right? Now,
Right.
yeah,
Or
this
if
is
you
great.
find out that the Order of Paladins that you have all been befriending is, falling apart for
Right,
some reason.
right,
Well, let's
right.
find out. Um, but yeah, you got to bring it into the present. And I mean, the counterexample for all about the present is like the Silmarillion.
Yeah, right.
Um, like, would we
I
have
mean,
the Lord of the Rings if Professor Tolkien hadn't like essentially farted around with Elvish languages and 5,000 years of
wrote a
history,
bunch of songs.
a bunch of songs, and it's like, oh look, the Lay of Baron and Luthien. Oh, this is great and romantic, and there's werewolves. Great. What?
Yeah,
None of this appears in Lord of the Rings.
yep.
Well, the Silmarils sort of vaguely, but I mean, but for him, it was important
Mhm,
in order to do the world building he wanted to do and tell the story he wanted to tell. So if you care and you want to fill up 3 notebooks worth of world building,
mhm.
I say go for it.
Yeah.
Just don't expect your players
Although
to care.
I kind of want to go to Amazon and see what the star rating is on the Similarian.
Uh,
Probably not so good.
Not as good as The Hobbit and The
Right.
Lord of the Rings, because it does feel sometimes like his notebooks. And the further you get into the ephemera, right,
Yeah, right.
the
Right.
more it's like, this really is the notebook they hauled out of the back of the attic.
Right. Right. So one thing that I've often thought about, because I tend to lean towards using other people's campaign worlds because I'm very lazy and it's a lot easier for me to grab someone else's.
Oh,
But
yeah.
but there's also something about the amount of energy and resources that go into a published campaign setting that
Yeah.
I can't replicate, right? Like I can't,
No.
you know, how much money has been spent on the Forgotten Realms, right? Like
A lot.
a lot. I
Millions.
don't have that much, you know, right, right. How many authors have written for the Forgotten Realms? How many,
I don't even know.
right? How
Hundreds?
many editors? How many editors have edited text that other people wrote for the Forgotten?
So many.
Right. So why would I not capitalize on that? But that's, you know, that's actually in the, it's, you know, according to my flawed surveys that I've done, it's most people still continue to play with their own campaign world,
Yeah. No, I saw that
capitalizing on these other ones.
from my very earliest days working on Dungeon Magazine. Every poll we ever did,
Mhm.
what campaign setting are you using? Well, it's like Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, and my own stuff. And it
Mhm.
could be like a third, a third, a third. but there was always a huge contingent of homebrew, and I love that crowd, right?
Mhm.
That's me.
Mhm. Right. You just
I
homebrewed
have,
and then turned it into Midgard.
well,
Like, become a
yeah,
publisher and give
but
it to
there's
everybody.
a really important step that happens there to get it ready to publish, right? Like the notes I bring on a Friday night aren't publishable. And for most DMs, that's not the goal, right?
Mhm.
It's like, I want to show my players a good time. Do I want to publish it in a 300-page hardcover? Yeah, I want to, but do I want to do 2 years of work to get it there?
Right.
Do I want to lay out thousands of dollars for art and editing? Maybe not.
But you did.
Well, I did. Oh my
Not
God.
everybody.
I'll tell horror stories about the very first Midgard hardback. That thing almost broke the company.
Really?
Uh,
That
World
so that
building
what
is,
that tells me is more value. I got more value out of it.
it was fun. It was, yeah, you did, because we pinched every penny and I pulled in every favor I knew. And I was like, can we make this work on the budget we had pre Kickstarter?
Mhm.
Oh my,
Right.
the budget for the first Midgard hardcover was sliced 10 ways from Sunday. And I think we obscured pretty well how much blood, sweat, and tears was required to even get that book out. The second edition, of course, the fifth edition version of Midgard, we had a budget because we had a Kickstarter.
Mhm.
So it was easier,
Mhm.
but there was still an enormous amount of, this isn't right.
Mhm.
And this is one of the problems with published settings is the bigger they get and the more successful they get, the harder it is to put out a new edition. I don't know how the Forgotten Realms people do it other than burn it down and start over, right?
Right.
um, that seems like a more and more logical solution to me the longer
Yeah, but it didn't have a lot of fans. Oh.
nobody loves it except the people who are like, let's make it easy for new people to get their
Right.
brain around it.
Right. Right. That's the
um,
thing.
like Lost Minds, right?
Mhm.
Start small.
Yeah. Right. Or yeah, focus on the Sword Coast, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
we're just gonna use this little slice right over here.
Well, and that's a way to start small. Maybe it's not the village, maybe it's the region, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
For me, it was Zobek in the Midgard setting,
Mhm.
which was the region that is sort of like Greyhawk was, or the Sword Coast, or pick your favorite example, Barovia for Ravenloft, and just a smaller slice of the whole thing. Um, because everybody wants there to be an entire huge world, but the fact is the players are only going to explore a portion of it.
Mhm. Mhm.
So focus on that
Yeah.
and hint at the ancient history.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess there's talking about that idea of starting small. There's when you have sort of the resources that Wizards of the Coast has, and they decided to start small. Like they can hire
For,
100 writers to work on something, right? If they
yeah,
wanted to.
but in their case, I think the decision comes from the other direction. They're trying to make the audience happy with it, right?
Right.
They could spend the money and do a 12-volume set on the Sword Coast if they
Mhm. Yeah,
wanted.
right.
Does any and there are people who want to buy
Oh
a
yeah, sure.
12-volume
Yeah.
set, right? Probably
I
me
mean, I'd
included.
buy it, but I buy everything.
Right. But they were thinking like, for new role players who don't have their arms around the realms and barely know what it is,
Mhm.
and who are still getting sort of comfortable with the rules and role playing as a hobby, do you want to hit them with a big fat hardcover
Mhm.
that's maybe $50 or a box set, or do you just want to say, here's the village and here's some mines,
Mhm.
go explore?
Right.
um,
Watch
and
out for the dragon.
watch out for the drag. I think
Yeah.
this is why Keep on the Borderlands was so
Mhm.
successful, right?
Mhm.
It's not overkill, and it's really hard as a game master to take that urge and like dial it
Mhm.
down,
Mhm.
because I think there's a very nerdly instinct to say, let's explain everything and let's have,
Fill in
here,
all the gaps.
fill in all the
Yeah.
gaps. I actually had a reader recently on Facebook say to me, you know, you guys put out the Midgard campaign setting and it's just a teaser for the setting. And I'm
It's like
like,
it's this thick.
it's a
Right.
450
It's a,
page book.
it's a
It's like,
phone
it's
book.
not enough. Like, it's a teaser. You've led me on.
Right.
Like,
Did you look at it just like, well, get to work? Right? Go start writing, man. Fill it out.
I was like, okay, that's an interesting perspective. But for some people, you want to go that deep right away.
Yeah.
And that person is the game master. And the players are like, where are we?
Right. Right. So
Who's in this bar?
when should a game there's probably I don't know that there's ever advice one can give on something like this because I have a feeling that DMs are just going to go whatever direction they like.
They've all
But
got different styles.
yeah, are there what are some choices? What how can a DM choose whether to go with a published campaign setting or go homebrew?
Right. Well, I mean, some of it is just time, right? If you have no time to speak of,
Yeah.
or if you're just desperate to get it together for Friday and you're like, if you prefer to just say, I'm taking it out of the box and making it my own, great. There are a lot of fantastic DMs who will take, oh, I don't know, Fantastic Adventures, right? Or Eldritch Lairs or something like that, and just run everything in it the way they want to run it and string it together. Um, I think partly it's knowing what your style is, right? So some people just want sort of a framework, and then the fun of it is in the play of it
Mhm.
and figuring out which parts of it resonate for you and your players, and can you do these funny voices, and are goblins good or whatever. If you if you want to do the extra work and prep for deep homebrew and world building, you got to want it pretty bad, because it's going to eat a certain chunk of your prep time, right? And you're going to spend prep time on world questions like, what's the trade route here, or what's the city council like, and what is law and justice like in this town, right? Which are all interesting questions, and I love pursuing them. But you don't need to pursue them if your players aren't the wild, law breaking types, or if they look at that town. Okay, they're all the law breaking
They
types.
might all start that way.
I've had some groups that are mostly law abiding, but they might just see that town and say, we really want to go out to the ruins in the hills. We're skipping the town. We're just buying 50 feet of rope and moving on.
Right, or 10-foot pole.
Yeah, we bought our 10-foot pole. And you're sitting there going, but the town council, yeah, we don't want to help them. Right? Every game master has had the, I've got 10 hooks in this town and the players just rode through story.
Mhm.
Um, and, the lazy DM is all about this, is don't prep the thing you don't need.
Right.
Um, so world building, a lot of it gets thrown away.
Mhm.
And if you're homebrewing like mad, this was the realization that I came to, was doing all this homebrew and world building is really satisfying for me.
Mhm.
I love doing it and I love sharing some of it. But when it comes time to play, it's actually something else. My players aren't there for me to share my homebrew with.
Mhm.
They're there for the adventure and the jokes among themselves. And I get to play the mustache twirling villain.
Mhm.
And like, we're all playing characters. I've got all these great NPCs and villains. The part of homebrew that I bring to the table tends to be very character focused. So it's the good guys, the bad guys, it's the prince in distress.
Mhm.
Um, so if your world building and homebrewing is all heavily based around characters and hooks, great. You're going to use a ton of it at the table. If it's all genealogy, um, yeah, you could be happy with that. I write out a lot of heraldic descriptions, a lot of shields and coats of arms, and no one at my table except this one player ever cares.
Mhm.
But I care. And then
Right.
when in the Midgard book, it's like every little nation, it's right there. There's the coat of arms. And it's sort of a nod to Gary and Greyhawk, because he loved that stuff too. Um, but it's not something you need. It's flavor for the world. It's a
Mhm.
little bit of sprinkly spice on top. Um, Honestly, the sprinkly spice on top stuff in world building tends to stick with players more than the in-depth stuff. Like, everybody remembers frosting, glitter, and sparkles, the stuff that you like that's snazzy. Um, it bugs me sometimes that the throwaway lines gather as much momentum and traction as they do, because I'm
Mhm.
like, that was a throwaway. And eventually I go around, my first reaction is, you're missing the part that I care about,
Right.
which is weird. And I always see myself doing this. Like, they're not here for that. They're here for the other thing. And I've put out a giant trail of pixie dust for them. Right. Well, that's a good thing. They like that part of the setting. Let's do more of it.
Mm.
And that was the lesson I learned between first edition Midgard and second edition of Midgard. Like, there's stuff in the fifth edition Midgard setting that gets way bigger play than it did in the first book, um, because people dug it. Like the Bear Folk or the Shadow Fae, they all appeared somewhere in an adventure, um, or a write-up, and people glommed onto it. Oh, the Bear Folk actually showed up in a monster book. They showed up in Tome of Beasts, and everybody was like, "These are great." I'm like, "Yeah, thank you very much." And then, like, "Can we play one?" It's like,
If you ever make a
I
monster, they're gonna
I
want to make a
missed a
character.
bet. Oh, I was an idiot. Bear Folk should have been a player race from the start. And they're in the first Midgard book, but kind of as NPCs you would go visit once in a while. And once someone turned it around and said, "I want to play one," oh yeah, of course you do. Ooh,
So, so with the recognition of that many DMs like to homebrew their world,
yeah.
what are your highest expectations for how somebody will take something like Midgard and bring it into their game?
My highest expectation for Midgard is someone will strip it for parts.
Okay.
Um, I mean, if they don't, it's very flattering. We have 100 adventures written for it, short ones, long arcs, collected series. If you just want to say, I take leyline magic and I take the Bear Folk and the Shadow Fae, and those fit in my setting, more power to you, right? Because I've done that to other people's settings for
Mhm.
decades. I have taken the highlights and I've just run with them. Um, and the original purpose of the Midgard setting was, hey, let's hang adventures on this. Oh, God, I really want to talk about using adventures to do world building. That's what Gygax did with Greyhawk for years. But we could go back to that maybe.
Yeah, I'll bookmark that one.
Put bookmark that one. Um, but it was built. Midgard was built to be easy to drop in. Like the adventures are all written as, you need a forest, or this happens along a cold coastline, and uh, this has come to bite me later. People have picked up Midgard adventures and said, "This says it takes place along a temperate coastline." And I say, "Uh huh." And they're like, "Where's that on the map?" Wherever you need it to be.
Right.
We were kind of deliberately vague so that you wouldn't have to worry about it. They're like, "Well, we want a definitive answer." Uh, that was,
You're like, just let go a little. Just let
let
go of
go
the
a little bit.
it's
Like,
okay. Take a deep breath.
right,
Yeah.
it could be on this side of the strait or that side. What is more convenient for your campaign? We want you to run the adventure. All it takes is a coastline and a village.
Yeah.
I'm like, but once you start putting adventures in a place, right, they soak up some of the local ambiance. And that's what happened with Zobek, right? It was like, we need a city to put in the adventure background section of all these adventures we're doing with Cobalt Press. Like, you start in the city of Zobek. It was like the default, right?
Mhm.
Um, we didn't want to flesh it out very much. We're like, okay, we're going to do one city worth of world building. That's it. And then we're going to quit because we'll just use that one as the springboard. There will be a forest nearby, there'll be mountains nearby and plains. It'll be easy. And then, of course, the question was, what's over the hills? Um, so yeah, strip it for parts. I don't feel precious about it. I think the Midgard elves are wonderful. I think the Shadow Fae are great. I love the dwarves. Um, but if they only turn into, hey, the cantonal dwarves are this one weird, wacky hillbilly group of dwarves in my campaign who don't have a king, um, well, all right, that's fine, right? You got something out of it, and you stripped it for parts, and that's what it's for. Where it's a shared world. It's got about 7 or 8 major authors in Midgard, right? Everyone thinks it's my campaign setting, but the 7 regions in the original book were all written by different people like Brandon Hodge or Jeff Grubb. So there are multiple world builders. That's why they feel so different.
Mm-hmm.
And then the editor had the nightmare task of bringing them all together.
Get the voice.
But yeah, what it meant was if we had 7 different sections, they're easier to pull back apart, right?
And they're good for that restripping.
Yeah, they're good for that restripping. It's like, well, this is the section of the War God. Well, this is the section of the Badlands. This is the Norse kind of thing. Well, those are themes that can resonate in any high fantasy. This is the elf territory.
Yeah, the Ghoul Kingdom.
Well, I'm gonna put a marker down on that and say that's very Midgard. It doesn't really appear everywhere else. But
no, it doesn't. But I can stick it. Like that's the one I'm gonna take and
right. It's
my
like
world.
Exactly. So that one, yeah, if you steal that, that's exactly the sort of underworld I prefer, right? Who needs drow? Elves. The undead don't need to breathe. They will rule the underworld. And so that kind of world building that's meant to be taken apart it has certain weaknesses because it means the connections aren't as tight. You are able to disengage this town and that adventure from everything around it. I don't know. D&D has been like this from the start, right? People have borrowed one another's work. Even if you go back and you look at Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, they were like sticking their elder gods in one another's short fiction, right? And Conan has bits of Smith in it.
Right.
And that's fine. I think sharing that kind of stuff is great. Barrier Peaks is a beautiful example of, I'm just going to swipe some lasers and stick them.
Put a spaceship in here.
Right. And I was like, that's brilliant. And Gygax did the Beyond the Magic Mirror, the Wonderland stuff too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
mash it up.
Mash it up. I'm a big believer in mashing. And what you get then is your players saying, that's genius. And you can be justifiably proud of the way you've twisted and warped and made it yours, right? Even if a bunch of the core ideas, okay, so this is a ghoul kingdom, but now it's my ghoul kingdom.
Right. So what are so you mentioned earlier of the importance, I think it was your third of the 3 tips of making sure the players are on board.
This is something I do more now. I don't know who started with, it's probably Burning Wheel and Luke Crane, or maybe it was Jonathan. I forget who started way back in the indie scene saying, get your players involved in world building, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one way, at least, to get them involved just in a veto sense is to say, hey, I'm running this kind of campaign. The parameters are you have to play an elf, a half elf, or a human, or a gnome. And, beyond that, this, that, and the other thing. Try and tell your players, we're not going to have a lot of Warforged in this. Is fine as long as they're on board. And then the next step of that is don't just get buy-in, right? Push some of the work onto the players, which is, you have an order of paladins, or you're from a circle of druids.
What's that called?
Yeah.
Who's the assassin guild that's after you?
Right. Tell me about them. And who's this enemy of yours? Oh, you left town with huge debts. Who do you owe them to?
Right.
And then, of course, that's world building, right? Because those are the characters. If they're handing you villains and saying, I pissed off a bunch of diabolical infernal hell cultists, it's like, oh, well, that's a whole adventure arc right there, and I can write up that cult, or I can go swipe that cult from other sources. And in the moment they've done that, it's not just their character's place in the world is kind of fixed, right? They're putting themselves in the setting in a way they're comfortable with.
Did you do this sort of collaborative world building in the published worlds that you built?
Not for Planescape, not for Al-Qadim. There was the collaboration. Well, the Planescape collaboration was very minor, right? Like, here's your outline, go to town. Or
Mhm.
Zeb Cook has written this in the Planescape core box. Use it as the outline for a whole new box, right?
Right.
Um, so people would share data points, but it wasn't, hey, let's go back and forth.
Mhm.
For the Cobalt Press stuff, we used to have some forums, open forums, where we would brainstorm stuff all day long. And it would just be concepts and ideas. And I think that's where a lot of the early Midgard stuff comes from. So I love shared worlds where you are knocking ideas around. But in my at the table play, I'm actually a pretty latecomer, right? Like, indie guys have been doing that kind of shared world building for a decade now.
Mhm.
And I'm just enough of a game master control freak to say,
No.
no.
No, this is the way the paladins are.
Right. I've been working on this setting for a year. These are
Right.
your choices. You could pick the sun god or you could pick this.
What about a wind god? No. No
No.
wind gods.
Well, from the distant east, hardly known or explored.
No, they're filled out.
Yeah,
I got
sorry.
some maps.
They're unpublished, but oh, come on. Yeah. People do still bring stuff into the game that they want, and game master, you want your players to be happy, and you want their character concepts to work for the rest of the story and the other players. So unless it's wildly out of line, I mean, you can try to adapt, but at some point you also want people to say, hey, all this world building you've done, I like parts of it. Here are the parts I like this is my hometown, or these are my people, or I learned at this academy. And if they layer more on top of that, then you get something that's stronger. It's partly their creation, partly your creation.
So yeah, so beyond the collaborative world building aspects, which I think is a really interesting way to do it. But if you're generally bringing, particularly if you're bringing like a published setting, if I bring in Midgard, or I'm bringing Glorantha, or I'm bringing
Sure.
even specific reaches of the Forgotten Realms, what are some of the best ways to get your players to, what are the things you actually want to give to your players to, like, here's what you need to know about this world,
Right.
that isn't all the coat of arms?
Yeah. The three things I tend to tell people are about a region, right? Are who's in charge, what's going horribly wrong. And because of my predilection for Midgard's dabbling deities, I tend to say, who are the gods or religious powers involved, right? Which might not work for other settings. It certainly would work for RuneQuest. It might work for the realms.
Mm-hmm.
I love writing Pantheon chapters, but that's but like, who's in charge, right? Like, if it's the village, if you're the heroes and you show up, I'd like to have like the nobles or the chief of the thieves guild or somebody who's an authority show up and talk to one of the players at some point, and some point fairly early, to have them marked out as, you're not just children off the farm who took their pitchforks into the dungeon, right? Like, people have kind of figured out that you have saved the day once or twice, and they either want to threaten you to back off, or they want to bring you under their wing and have you do the stuff they want them to do. So that brings them into the wider world, right? If, like, the powers that be, in a modern context, if the establishment embraces them, that's one thing. If the establishment says they're rebels and they must be destroyed, then I get to do my Vader voice, and fear will bring them in line. I love having that conflict between individuals and the state, and that's personal to me, right? Like, that's part of my GMing style, is your individual murder hobos. That's great. This is the court of the Shadow Fae.
Right.
They've been around for thousands of years. They don't give a shit.
Yeah,
right?
they're not putting up with your crap.
They're not putting up with your crap. Like, your 8th level. That's great.
That's nice.
You have a great
right.
base attack. That's awesome. Look at those muscles. Move along.
Right.
Right?
Here's my pack of displacer beasts.
Yes, exactly. And I'm like, okay. And the first time I hauled out the snooty elves in the Shadowfey, the players were like, come on, we're hot shit. Everyone back in Zope,
No,
please,
you're
we're hot
not.
shit. No, not here,
No.
you're
You
not.
may have been.
Right. And
Now you got their attention.
yeah, exactly. So, and not everybody's going to want to do that, right? Like other campaigns may be about being the sneaky rebels, or it may be about saving X, Y, or Z person, or a family conflict, or the big bad dragon that burnt down my village when I was a child, right? There are many other stories, but I love individuals versus the state, or individuals serving as agents of the state. So I think you need to figure out what your own personal tells are as a game master.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's the stuff that gets you excited? Because while I love the shared world building,
Mm-hmm.
um, if I'm not excited about my
Yeah,
game,
right. If they go in a direction you don't want to go, you're like,
uh,
I don't
uh,
care
we can
about any of that.
we can do that for
now
a
I gotta
session or
now I gotta
two.
prep a game about that.
Yeah, I'm
Right.
like, oh, that's so boring. Oh, the bookkeeping's going to be horrendous. Please do not explore this trade route. Oh God, not mercantilism again. And they've all got the dollar signs lighting up their eyes. Like, look, we bring Moonsteel from the Shadowfey to Zobek. We'll be rich.
So one thing I noticed in campaign settings in fourth edition, and I would not be surprised if this was elsewhere, was the idea of sort of the 5 or 6 truths about the campaign setting. The sort of
Yes,
the
there
thing
are
you could sort of
7
hand
of
to a
them in
player.
Midgard.
Right, right. There's 7 of them in Midgard.
Seven
Is
things
this
to
a
know.
new, like you've worked on, game worlds for a long time. What is this, a new invention? Did this come from somewhere that you know of?
I know we used to keep little lists of like what are touchstones for certain settings,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like Dark Sun, it's like there's never enough water, right?
Yeah, right,
Um, there is not enough metal.
right.
Like it is
The
scarcity,
world
right?
hates you. Yeah.
The world hates you. Never give them more metal than they know what to do with. That's breaking the ethos of the setting,
Right.
right? Planescape is always weirder than you think, right?
Mhm.
So there are those kind of things to know. Um, I think making them explicit and handing them out in a published form is relatively new.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it's to me, I've been using it for a while. Just whenever I'm bringing, even whether it's published or not, or even if it's a small focused thing or not, that idea of like for the players, I don't expect them to know a lot about the area, but like here are 6 important things you want to keep in mind, like when you're building your characters or when you're thinking
yep,
about how your characters are going to interact with the world. Like
yep,
the gods are dead, you know, like well,
that's an important thing to
that's
know.
an important thing to know before you build your cleric, right?
Yes, and I think, yeah, any world builder would be smart to come up with that list.
Yeah, or like the
Um,
one page, here's the one page that you need to know about this world that has the most important things that set it apart from every other world that exists in
right. I mean,
fantasy,
if
right?
you say in Midgard, hey, there's ley lines and magic
Right.
flows and rivers
Yep.
through the land. Oh, well, that leads to all sorts of interesting
Yeah.
questions from
Right.
every arcanist in your group.
I love the ley lines.
I do too, but it's a thing that isn't obvious. It's
Yeah.
certainly not in the standard D&D rule set. So how would they even know?
Yeah. I love Bemia and I love the
Yay!
wastelands and
Well,
I just
they're
want to
some of the oldest part of the setting, right?
yeah.
Like Zobek came way later than the Majocracies.
Right. Right. So as you know, you were an editor of Dungeon and Dragon magazine
Yes, I was
for some time, right?
for some years, 5 years.
5 years. And so did you, I presume that you saw people write in with their ideas for campaign worlds beyond just like, I'm pitching you an adventure.
Mostly it was pitches for adventures when I
Yeah.
was on Dungeon, right? Occasionally we would get someone say, "I've got the greatest campaign world," but they were rare, and
Yeah.
we
Okay.
kind of threw those back
Like we
immediately.
don't care. Like we can think up worlds too.
It was the second edition era. It's like
Yeah,
we've got
right. We're
16
good.
out back
We're
that we're
good
not
on
even
world.
publishing, right? Like we're good.
Yeah.
But I get them now at Cobalt Press. I
Yeah.
still get people writing in saying, because I have an open door policy on submissions.
Huh.
And it's kind of a heartbreaker because often they're like, I have 16 notebooks
Yeah.
and I want you to edit and develop and illustrate and publish it and send me the check.
The villain from Seven. He's got
Yeah.
9,000 notebooks. I hand stitched every one of them.
I know. And I'm like, I'm glad you did that world building. It sounds like you enjoyed it and you're very proud of your work and you're played for a long time. What I can't really bring myself to say most of the time is it's totally unpublishable in its current form.
So what are the things that make it so? Yeah, when you look at like what people submit, even though it's a relatively smaller set than Adventures,
Yep.
what are some of the things? I guess I'll start with the more interesting question, which is what are the kinds of things that caught your eye and went, huh, like that? That's interesting.
Oh, yeah. Well, the things that make me say, tend to be the ones who have structured a kind of fantasy that I wish I had written, right? Like, oh, this is a new kind of elves, or this is like death metal fantasy, right? It's Frank Frazetta brought to life. It has a hook right away, and I'm like, the world is dying. There are raiding bands. I'm like, wow, that's pretty grim. This is very Mad Max. I would
Yeah.
never write this, but I would play the hell out of this, right? It's like Gamma World meets Fury Road. Go to town. I'm like,
I'm scared.
fascinating. Not my kind of thing, but as a publisher, I go, I bet there are a lot of people who would dig this,
Yeah.
right?
It's like
And
Rob Schwab's Godless.
yeah,
Yeah.
like Godless is absolutely that. Yeah. So all of those things that I say, is there an audience for this? And have you thought it through enough to like, do you have a decent name for this thing? Like, who are the major players? How is this well developed? Like, how serious are you about it, right? Do you have an outline? Do you have a look in mind? Like, the pitch for a world setting is almost never going to happen. I mean,
Mhm.
the sad reality of most RPG companies is we can barely keep our own in-house settings
Mhm.
fully supported for the amount of stuff that people would love to have. Like, people are asking for more Midgard. Great. People are asking for more Forgotten Realms. Great. People are not just asking for more Forgotten Realms. They know how much Wizards could do. They're like, where's the Dragonlance? Where's the Eberon? Where's everything, right? Where's my Planescape book?
Where's my Spelljammer?
Where's my Spelljammer,
And then
right?
it's a bunch of trolls who are like, where's Spelljammer?
I'm like, okay. But like the amount of work to keep any world feeling fresh is pretty high. So taking on a commitment from somebody who says, I've got a whole world, I mean, even if it seems interesting and it's like there's an audience for it, the way to gauge that and the way to get that to be published is either do it yourself,
Mhm.
and you'll quickly realize just how much work the not designing part of it, but the everything that comes after design is, um, or parse it out to people in bits. And Ed Greenwood was a genius at this. If you go back in the history of D&D, the Forgotten Realms did not start as a full box campaign setting. It started as a bunch of articles about Elminster in Dragon Magazine.
Hmm.
Well, you can't go publishing articles about your campaign setting in Dragon Magazine anymore.
But you
But
can make a blog.
if you make a blog,
Right.
it's no one can tell you no,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
if you can do that and you have a live stream of your game, um, and you draw an audience,
Mhm.
fantastic,
Mhm.
right? Like you're already building your own audience, and that makes it easier for you to kickstart it, which gets you the funds for the art and the editing and hiring all the people you're going to need to bring your vision to life.
Mhm.
Because the alternative is get so successful that someone else brings your vision to life. And
It's a hard sell.
well, it it is if nobody knows you and you don't have a publication track record, right? Like if you have never published on DM's Guild, if you don't have a blog, if no one else has paid you a few bucks for a little thing, then why should I commit my company to years
Yeah.
of work, right? Like I want to go with a trusted person. Green Ronin is genius at this, by the way, right? Like they got the rights to the RPG for Game of Thrones
Mhm.
from George Martin before the TV series happened. And they did the same. I mean, with The Expanse, I guess they waited till after the TV show, but they've got the rights to that world, right?
Right.
Um,
And I think did they get Tal'Darai?
they did.
Yeah.
Yes, they did. They got
Yeah. Right.
Matt Mercer and
Mhm.
James Hake to
Mhm.
write that. So I mean, those are settings with a track record. Do I want Tal'Dorei? Heck yes. Did they beat me to the punch? Yeah, they did. Um, but if you have the next Tal'Dorei, please come see me, right? I'd love to talk.
Mhm.
And so there are people now who are streamers just getting started. And if they want to hit me up in 6 months when they hit certain streaming benchmarks,
Right.
I'm all ears. But if you just sort of show up and say, my players love it, it's a little bit like showing up at the art contest and saying, my mom says I drew a good picture.
Mhm.
Well,
My mom, by the way, says I run a really mean podcast. So, and she's in the chat, I
it's
think, right
true.
now. She'll,
See,
yeah. I mean, I don't know if she's right or not.
family support is important, but I don't think it's going to get you published. I don't know. I want people to be realistic about the odds of publishing a whole campaign setting. It was incredibly difficult for me to get Midgard out the door. Um, and I had all the advantages of, hey, I worked at TSR. Hey, I knew what an editorial calendar was. Hey, some of my friends are people like, I don't know, Todd Lockwood or other artists, right? I was very fortunate. For other people, like, their kind of being fortunate is, hey, I've been running a live stream and it's really popular. Hey, my blog does well. Hey, I run a podcast and I've done this amazing series of lazy DM books, right?
An amazing series of two.
It was a series.
Two is a series. I could draw a line.
I'm sure there will be a third someday.
Someday. I don't know. Please, no, not for a
No.
while. I'm
All right.
tired. I'm very tired.
Well, that's just it, right? They're not 400 pages long, are
No,
they?
they are not. That's right.
They're
Yeah.
full color.
So they are full color. Yeah, I got it right.
See.
So, so let's go back to that bookmark that we put in place
Oh yeah.
for adventures as world building. How can one build world? So is this both from a publisher standpoint or a homebrew or both?
I think it's both, and it actually ties in neatly with the question of how do you get your whole setting published, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Greyhawk was around before the Greyhawk box set, for instance, right? You can go back to the Giants modules or the Underdark modules or any number of Greyhawk Lost Caverns and say, they're all set in some sort of place. What is that place? Well, it's Greyhawk. It says so right here in the introduction. Where do I find out any more about Greyhawk? You don't, because nothing was published in the 70s and 80s until that first box, which went off like a bomb. Like, what? You can publish all this world stuff in one set of covers and not glean it from adventures?
Was that I presume this is a stupid question, that it was the first box set of a game world that came out for D&D?
No. Empire of the Petal Throne beat it to the punch, which no one except most gamers today don't know about EPT.
Hang on, let me go Google that.
It's really, really cool. I love it to pieces. It was written by a linguist for Central American languages. It has a weird caste structure and it's totally non-Western. I want to say it's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's weird and wonderful. So it wasn't the first, but once that,
75.
Yeah, it was way early. But no one could wrap their brain around it except like a few. So like the first world building sets came out pretty soon, but Adventures as world building is a great way to go because you can put in a group of villains, right, that are important to your world. You can talk a little about the NPCs or the village or the starting point or the kingdom it's in. Honestly, like Zobek started as a hook for Adventures. You got to save the town. And the more you do that, the more of those adventures you publish that seem to all be about the same place, the more curiosity you will get from people who buy it from you on DM's Guild, or people who play it at a convention. And so, sort of a very slow way to do world building, but you only have to reveal very small pieces at a time. And if each of your adventures contains another little hex worth of overland map, then you don't have to draw the whole world map at once either. So it's incremental, it's slow. I like slow and incremental world building. It gives you time to think about it.
So you think there's an advantage doing that in a home campaign as well?
Yeah.
Like just working on your next adventure and letting that build out a little piece of the world and so on?
Yeah, because the next adventure is the part the players care about most. And
Right.
if you focus your efforts on doing the most awesome and amazing adventure possible, then your players are coming back every week demanding more, right? And if you focus most of your limited prep time on genealogies and coats of arms, it's like, oh man, it feels like this adventure got slapped together on note cards in about 10 minutes. Like, you need to give it at least 20, right? No, 20 is not enough.
That's 10 too long.
I may be talking to the wrong person here. Right. But honestly, I think the little hints that you put in about who's the big bad in here, or what treasure have you pulled out? It's like, this is a sword that belonged to this order of paladins. Really? Should we return it to them? No, it's too valuable. Will they come after us if they know it's been found? Maybe. Right? Like, suddenly you've handed them a treasure in this adventure, and you've also handed them a key to a bunch of world building, which is somebody made this sword, somebody still cares about it, a whole order is devoted to its recovery. Holy shit, who are these guys?
Right.
Right? And suddenly the world has opened up a little, because in the next village, oh, there was a guy here asking about you.
So one thing I forgot to mention is you were very gracious in offering us an extra half hour of your time.
Oh yeah, totally.
Or until you get hungry and hang up.
Yeah, once I get hangry, I'm gonna start. World building's a total waste of time.
I thought you said that earlier. Oh, wait a minute.
To some degree.
That was the summary. Summary
It.
version. A lot nicer.
Yeah, no, I'll hang around. I will talk world building till you guys like kick me off.
They're like, we gotta go, man. You're
gonna play me off like at the Oscars, a big.
So yeah, so we will get to audience questions here in a bit, but I got
Yes, we will. We should totally take some. I saw some on Twitter.
Oh yeah, there's a bunch of nice ones. We'll get to them in just a.
All right.
But I'd like to talk. So if we focus down a little bit, what are some good ways to build cities?
Ooh,
you talked about.
I have thoughts about this.
Yeah, I know, because you gave me the question, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think that to a remarkably degree, the history of fantasy RPGs is the history of famous cities, right? You start with Greyhawk. You can go to Waterdeep. You can pick up Sigil if you like. It's weird, but it's a lot of fun.
I love Sigil, yeah.
I know, and that was my first big published city assignment, right?
Wow.
I got Zeb Cook said, well, I've named some wards and here's some NPCs, and like, go to town. I'm like, well, how long does my thing have to be? I don't forget. 96 pages? Like, Well, the reason cities are such great keystones for world building is that you have to define daily life. And I mean, not adventuring life, right? Like, you have to answer all the questions about what do they drink? Who do they worship? Who's in charge? Who hates who?
Right.
Is there a ghetto?
Who handles the night soil?
Yeah, who handles the night soil? Well, the kobolds from the ghetto handle the night soil and are pleased to have the work. I mean, really, right?
Until they revolt.
Until they revolt. Well, and there's an adventure, right?
Sparta Town.
But it's a great opportunity to say, what do they make here, right? Who gets paid? Who are the smugglers? Is there a wall? What's the army like? And what's law and order like? And will a tavern brawl get you, 50 lashes, dunked in the river, thrown in jail, a fat fine? And once you start defining that stuff, then you're also looking at like science and technology. Have telescope here? Do they print newspapers? Probably not. And the more you know about medieval life and scribes and how hard it is just to be fed and clothed when you have a non-industrialized society, it's like, damn, the Weavers Guild is really important, or everybody walks around with nothing to wear. You can spend a lot of time thinking about society. And so it's a world building microcosm is really what you're doing with every city, right?
Yeah, it almost feels like cities are harder than worlds.
I think they're as hard. Worlds, you can fake it a lot. Yeah,
Yeah, because
you
you
say,
can be relatively general.
yeah, there's a lot of open plains and orcs live here. Done.
Right, right. But
But
cities, I got to worry about every shop. Or not every
well, and I
shop.
think you can go too far, right? Like the Judges Guild City State of the Invincible Overlord was one of the first that tried to do every single shop.
Right.
And I know there are people who love that thing, and I'm going to piss them all off right now, which is what a waste of time that was. I don't care
Yeah,
about every shop. I
yeah,
care about the cool shops,
yeah. I think
right?
I have a Waterdeep City System box set sitting over there, and it
Yeah,
has like 900. It's got a glossary of like 900. I'm like, I can't even read it. Like,
I know.
I like
It's
it.
too
It's
much.
good, but oh my god.
But like the Zobek Gazetteers, like, okay, it's by sections, and
Right.
the cooler the thing is, the more of a page it gets.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, so you
if
can
it's
at
like,
least focus your eye on like, here's the one you need.
right, it's
Right.
the
If you're gonna bring
Arcane
characters
Collegium.
somewhere, take them there. Yeah.
Look, it's the Cobalt Ghetto. It's fascinating. Oh, look, it's the really seedy inn where all the Diabolists hang out. Let's talk about it for a while. So, yeah, city building forces you to think about trade and science and religion and technology and daily life. And once you've thought about some of that, you've either done a really great job of defining the rest of the world, within 100 miles of town, or you've made a horrible mishmash of Victorian England meets, I don't know, Mongol Asia. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. You have to have your ducks in a row and know something about history and society to make it a credible city, or you have to have such powerful fantasy that you can stick it on top of a spike out on the plains and everybody says, yeah, that's the place to be.
Hmm. What role does language have in world building?
I want to say I missed my calling by not learning Middle English and translating Beowulf and making up my own Elvish. Um, I think I started with an advantage because I was raised bilingual. No points for guessing what my second language was. But having additional languages, I think, helps with naming, and I think it helps with a sense of, like, if somebody's named Carl the Baker, that's pretty clear. If someone's named Klargosh the Necromancer, that's pretty clear. But if all the names seem a total hodgepodge, then you kind of lose an opportunity,
Hmm.
right? Like, Midgard is quite deliberately borrowing heavily from real world history so that we can say the names over here are kind of Slavic and the names over here are vaguely Spanish or Italian.
Hmm.
And many fantasy games do this. I think it's a really convenient shorthand to get your players to figure out who these people are,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Because your alternative is to say, here we are in Dark Sun. None of these are like Earth cultures. I'm going to have
Right.
to explain every one of them to
It's a
you.
lot of consonants.
Yeah, and it's context and it's info dumps and it's like, you can do it.
Right.
It's totally doable.
Right.
I think the players prefer a little bit of stereotype enough for them to say, oh, he's a Russian dwarf,
Hmm.
or, you know, sort of get who this guy is just from the way he's presented. Um, so I think language is a shortcut to character, and it's like vicious national stereotypes work for you.
Hmm.
Um, if the French perfumier shows up, everybody kind of gets it.
Hmm. So as we always have, Rudy Basso, our guardian angel, is on chat,
Yay!
and he is moderating all of the questions that came in and keeping track of the ones on Twitter and Twitch and everywhere else. And I think it's a good time to take some questions from the audience. So Rudy, what questions do
Yes.
you have for us?
Yes. Hello. First off, from Alpha Stream. Question.
Seriously, we're starting with Teos?
We are. He wrote question in all capitals. So,
Oh, well.
like an
I guess so
old-timey
if you want to know how
reporter.
to be first,
Yes.
all caps.
Capital letters will get my attention. How important is it when creating various lands in sorry, whoop, I didn't want to ask that one. Never mind. How do you
Veto on Alpha Stream's question.
How do you find this is also from Alpha Stream, he has several. How do you find the sweet spot of having standard recognizable stuff, species, classes, etc., and new stuff specific to your world?
That is an awesome question, and I struggle with it every project. Um, there is a sweet spot between those two things. Um, my own take on it is the boredom gauge. If I'm writing a set of whatever dwarves, elves, etc., and they are pretty much standard fantasy dwarves and elves, I often find myself sort of drifting as I'm writing and saying, these guys aren't that interesting. Um, and at some point I say, well, in Planescape, we would put a twist on this. And I start looking around for saying, what can we mash in with these bog standard races that makes them more interesting?
Mm-hmm.
So I think step one is to challenge the idea that standard fantasy elements have to stay standard, right? You can have a full campaign setting without high weirdness, but that reinvents elves in some way. And that, oh, I don't know, cannibal halflings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody remembers cannibal halflings from Dark Sun.
Mm-hmm.
So you can reinvent them on the existing skeleton. How much new, original, weird stuff to add? Well, the most extreme examples are things like Spelljammer or Dark Sun, where nothing has real world equivalents and everything requires, okay, the hip do, they're the British Navy, but but other than the give, actually, if you scratch hard enough, almost any setting will borrow from the real world. But
Right.
there's so much weird and outlandish
We'll make
stuff
him a
that's,
hippo.
yeah, that's the twist, right? He's a human, except he's
No
a
one
hippo.
will tell. No one will know it's
He's got
colonialist until it turns
epaulets
out.
on his shoulders. That makes him very official.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
I say.
And a monocle.
the-
Every one of them has to have a monocle.
They must have monocles. Well, but so on the one hand, if they're too standard, everyone is already familiar with them. They're tropes, they're stereotypes, and they're boring. Nobody wants that. And even those who do want that will get bored with them quickly.
You know,
If
or they have that, right? Like,
they have already got it.
right.
So you need the new stuff, which is what? Well, it's like Bearfolk and Midgard or Shadow Elves or whatever the new thing is.
Cool
I
characters.
want the new stuff. And the more jaded your audience is, right, the more they want that new stuff. So here's my rule of thumb. If you're writing for a beginner audience, or if your players are new, don't spend a lot of time on brand new races and the jade folk and the whatever, right? Because for them, dwarves and elves are already new,
Right. Yeah.
right? And if you are cracking this open for a bunch of new players, no matter what their age is, they're going to go, oh my God, elves, I can be a wizard. And that's the joy of RPGs at the start. If your audience is, I have been gaming for 20 years and I will tell you why you are wrong about everything. It's like, oh, I know that guy. I meet him at every convention. And I sort of love that guy, actually. He's like, you're going to bring like the most jaded and cynical perspective to this work and be a really tough critic. Well, for you, sir, we are going to provide not the standard elf and dwarf, but we're going to say, let's go full Spelljammer right from the start, right? So I think the answer is know your audience.
Yeah, good. Rudy, what else you got?
From Reverie333 in Twitch chat, what kind of content do you find people are most interested in or excited about when buying a campaign setting? Location description, history, NPCs, etc.
Good question.
That is a great question. I think the stuff that has gotten people most excited about campaign settings tends to be friction, hooks, where stuff is blowing up. Because if you leave it hanging, the old stacking gunpowder argument from the Kobold Guide to Worldbuilding, actually. If you leave parts of the campaign setting unresolved and say, there's a war brewing, but it hasn't happened yet, or the dragons have been raiding here constantly and no one can figure out how to stop them. what you're saying to the game master is, this is a place for adventure. This is a place where stuff is going to blow up. This is a place where things are unresolved. And people glom onto that, right? The other thing they glom onto is high fantasy and weirdness. Believe it or not, way back in its early days, Midgard was meant to be a gritty, realistic, low fantasy European setting. And man, we just injected the fantasy all over that and the high weirdness all over that, and it became way less European very quickly. And people love it, right? When we said half-dead gods in stasis stumble around the West, everyone said, "Oh, really? That sounds interesting. Let's go poke at that." And people wrote lost tombs out there, and it's all sorts of goodness.
Busted ley lines.
Busted ley lines, yeah. I mean, it's like where things are going horribly wrong and where things are weird and eldritch and strange. It's fantasy. If there's not a lot of magic, you might want to play something, like a D20 modern game, or D&D to me is at its best when it's really juicy. So don't give me the dry history. Give me the most exciting NPCs. Give me the flashpoints of danger, and give me the high weird.
So you touched on this a little bit, and this question kind of keyed it up in my mind too. It's something I've been thinking a lot about, which is when are we best off leaving things blank? Like even when we have sort of the angry, and I'll bring up an example of mine. So I have a book called Fantastic Adventures, and I have this kind of small town that was meant to be ripped out and replaced with whatever town you had, whatever town that the DM had. But I was like, I'll put one interesting feature. I'll have like a giant hand sticking out of the center of the town, and no one can figure out what it is. Nobody can break it. And then it's just this giant hand sticking right out. And they built a bar under it, right? And they like hang things from the fingers because it's like a really
awesome.
And I didn't do anything else with it. And I had so many people that are like, what's the hand? Like, what's down there? Like, is it connected to a whole body? Is it alive? And I'm like, I don't know, man. You tell me, right? Like, I don't. And
I think that's one of the biggest things to learn about world building is that you can't answer all the questions. If you do answer all the questions, you're doing it wrong, right? Because if you're a world builder for publication, other people are going to be running it. If you're a world builder at your table, you want to get your players excited to find out those answers and talking amongst themselves and picking the best one, right? So leave yourself some room. Yeah, leave a setting room to breathe is such great advice.
In Midgard, do you have examples of areas that you've left blank that still kind of excite you?
Oh yeah, there's a bunch of them that I'm still like, there's a lot in the north where we still haven't, Hyperborea, like the extreme north where the wind god Boreas lives, and all sorts of weird end time spirits and the giants. We haven't really touched it. I'm ready to go there anytime, but I'm like, we don't have to do everything right away.
Right.
And there are other places like in the deserts of the Southlands where it's like, well, there's a bunch of ruined cities on the map. We haven't touched them. We've barely got a sentence in them. And the editor actually came back to me in the second edition Midgard, said, you've still got places on the map that aren't really referenced much in the book. I'm like, it's already 400 pages long. We can't do everything. He's like, all right, just letting you know.
Right.
So yeah, what people want is the sense of possibilities, right? Let there be good stuff. And if they make it up, I'm fine with that.
Very cool. Rudy, what else you got?
I have a question.
Oh, Rudy,
are you allowed? Yes. Is this allowed?
It is allowed.
Oh my God, you've usurped.
I've done it.
You've taken over.
I am a guardian devil now, no longer a guardian angel. Okay. Woo. How often do you feel the need to update world events or world canon? And how do you do that if you don't have a line of novels constantly being released featuring a certain drow?
Yeah, I don't feel the urge to update stuff much at all. My home campaign ticks over much faster than the calendar does because I force it to. But world events, unless it's related to an adventure or someone asks, I don't do a lot of them. Like one a year is plenty, feels like. Um, I know the Realms is sort of notorious for the big earth-shaking events, but yeah, like
It,
kings and
it's
queens die and successors come along, and that's, mayors get replaced and castles get built, but it all happens really slowly. It's one of the joys of pseudo medievalism. Life was slow. They didn't put out a new, Wand of Magic Missiles 2.0 every year.
yeah, it was actually even when I was like 14. The what was the big event when the gods got all surly in Forgotten Realms? Man, my Forgotten Realms lore is terrible.
My lore is even worse.
God. Oh, name's right.
Like
all
this.
the gods, they all came down, a bunch of them died. And I remember reading the books, and I was like, man, I'm just starting to learn about this trilogy. I'm sorry, I'm just starting to learn about this world, and it's already all different. Like Bane is dead, and Merkel is dead, and
I mean,
I
that
was
said,
like, I just learned these guys.
I know.
Paul is dead.
So I tend to be fairly conservative about this. We've changed stuff over Midgard, but usually in response to adventures,
Mm-hmm.
and usually very slowly, like every 6 years.
Thank you, Dan Dillon. Time of Troubles.
Time of Troubles, that was it.
Man. I don't know who this Dan Dillon character is. Do you know who that is? I don't know.
Seems to know his stuff.
Yeah, apparently. Gotta watch
At least
out for
his
that guy.
realms.
Yeah.
All right, next question.
Yeah, next question.
Next question from Dax_Lawless. How would you introduce world-changing campaign mechanics like Spelljammer into your world that has been run more like a first edition gritty play game?
Oh, wow.
Somebody had to get Spelljammer in there.
Yeah. Well, the way I remember it being done when Spelljammer shipped was they just said, here they are, right? You can steal a ship and go to space.
Just do it.
It was just piracy, right? Or start the campaign there. I don't know. I think you gotta get your players buy-in on that kind of change, because if they're like, we're really happy with the way things are going and they don't want to go to space, then boo. Part of this is just my irkedness with Spelljammer makes travel too easy. It's really hard to introduce those kinds of halfway through the campaign, the rules change. I think it can be really satisfying if done well. If you've been leading up to it in some way, if the players have a real choice about it, if they can say no, that's good. If the players are sort of kidnapped, taken on the boat, and can never get home, they're gonna resent you. They're not gonna say, oh, you've made a wonderful change in the campaign. They're gonna say,
thanks for stealing all my magic items.
Right, you've stolen all my magic items. All of the people and places that we rescued are gone, and like everything we loved about the world is gone. And this happens in fiction all the time, but in tabletop RPGs, like players want to keep their toys.
Yeah, I've seen some adventures. I think now there's a couple.
There's a couple, and it's always very dicey.
Yeah, but like they'll have like a Spelljammer ship that's like embedded in a mountain, and you'll just see it in a cave. And there's like this theory of like, if they really want to spend a lot of time, they'll go over and screw with it. Otherwise, they'll be like, wow, that's weird, and they'll keep going on whatever their merry journey is.
And I think it's always fine to give players the option, right? I'm putting it right here. You could draw from the deck of many things, or you could ignore it. But if you aren't giving the players a choice, then I think you are screwing up this large campaign changing event.
Right. Rudy, what else you got?
From Blake Ryan Batman on Twitter. What mistake with world building have you learnt the most from?
Oh, that's a good one. I don't know. I think advancing the timeline too quickly is certainly a thing. I don't have a great answer for this. Oh, actually, I do have one.
This is gonna be a
one
good
makes me sad every time I tell it. I'm filing off the names to protect the innocent, but there's a section, there's a part of a campaign world that I'm really fond of that had a fantastic write-up and all this cool world building about it, and this hidden city and this jewel of culture and all these weird people, characters, and it was all in a place the players couldn't really get to. It was like a city in a bottle, invisible city kind of thing. I'm
They
like,
couldn't go
this
there.
is so awesome. And it's like, yeah, but the people who live there defend it, and if you visit, they wipe your memory. And I'm like, no, that's a horrible way to do this, right? Like, I get a hidden city, but it should be obvious, and the players should be the ones who discover it and have the joy of discovery and exploration. And saying you can't find it is just, yeah. So I very much regret that particular take. And if there's ever a new version of that setting, that would be something I would fix.
I mean,
Because
it sounds like you could almost extend that out to anytime you have campaign elements that weren't thinking about the characters.
right.
Right?
And like they can be the coolest thing ever. And if they're just for you, they're a mistake. Unless your audience is you, right? Like I'm willing to say there's world building you do for your own sake. But if you're publishing it or if you're running it at the table, then saying, haha, here's a cool thing you'll never see.
Right.
Yeah. And some of these things take years to pay off. There was, well, the Pathfinder people did this recently where they finally brought around the Rise of the Rune Lord stuff from their very start of their adventure paths. And it's paying off now, like 10 years later. They're doing the big reveal, right? So it's like, okay, you couldn't see it for 10 years, but now here it is.
Neat.
That's fine. But don't say never.
Right. Rudy, what other questions?
From AlphaStream1 in Twitch chat. Question: how important is it when creating various lands and nations to have connections between them? What kind of connections do you like to create?
Yes, I guess I could have used this as an answer to a different question, the prior question. It's a mistake not to connect them. You can have cool countries that are totally isolated like islands, and it's a shame if they don't connect. And I'll tell you why. You want them to connect so that they can hate each other and have conflict. War, religious schisms, any kind of conflict between nations and societies is fuel for adventures. So you want them to have trade connections, you want them to have religious or cultural connections, you want them to share borders. I'm always amazed some of the areas in the realms aren't connected, others are. That makes sense. I don't feel like everything needs to be connected to everything else, but there should be places where it's very clear that this nation and that nation came from the same stock, and now they've gone down different roads and they hate each other. Or these nations have always disliked one another, or these two nations have an uneasy alliance, right? Like if you can draw those kinds of connections early, you're making life easier for yourself or for your audience when they're looking around to say, you know, where can I start trouble? So the connections I like are religious, trade, and war. Any place that's likely to blow up. Money, power, that's all fun.
Rudy, you got any other questions?
Yeah, so let's close with this. Shortman Ian asks, if someone is new to 5th edition and has never heard of Midgard, what's your elevator pitch to get them interested?
Oh, perfect.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to end on that. Well, during the GM's Day sale, it's 78% off on drive-through.
Oh my God, I gotta buy it.
It's
I already
like
own it, but I'm getting more copies.
$12 for the Hero's Handbook and the World Book. It's like
What?
$7. Yeah, I know, it's stupidly cheap. But the pitch as to what's in it and the awesomeness that's in it is it's a dark world with strange magic, and it's full of ley lines, shadow elves, raven folk, and bear folk. It basically takes European history, puts it through a dark fantasy blender, and says, you want to walk through shadows, you want to be a hero, here's your opportunity. There are elder gods, There's all kinds of divine meddling. And most of all, there's like 100 adventures plotted out for it and available now for 5th edition. Some of them written by people like Mike Shea.
And Dan Dillon, who's sitting here in chat.
Dan Dillon.
Yep.
So it's a rich, vibrant setting that's been going on for 10 years now. And it's got a little something for everyone. The other thing I always pitch at conventions is it's called Midgard, but it's not all about Vikings. There's a lot of just traditional fantasy and other flavors. It goes more Central European, deep dark forest, German, Slavic, Turks with dragons. Yeah, that's sort of the elevator pitch. I am like the worst pitchman in the world for Midgard, honestly. I love it to pieces. And every time somebody says, well, why do you love it? I'm too close to it. You're asking the wrong guy. But support. Oh, we lose somebody?
Oh. Yep, right. Are you there, Wolf?
I warned you, my hardware's old. I'm here. You hear me?
Oh. I think I hear you.
Back? Maybe back?
You're back.
Oh, no. I'm back. Oh, my goodness. All right, I've said too much.
Oh, you're dropping again. All right. Well, Wolf, thank you very much for being on the show.
Without the video.
Yeah, I think we will call it a show right there. So I want to thank Wolfgang Baur for being on the show.
I don't. Mike, do his plugs. Check the Twitch chat.
Yeah,
there's a link to
homebrewpress.com.
the GM's Day bundle is insane. You get the Hero's Handbook and the World Core book for $13, I think. Check it out. Link in chat.
That is stupidly cheap.
Yeah.
Well, so I want to thank Wolfgang for being on the show. It was awesome to talk to him about all these things, world building. God, I got to get my head around all that. It was great. So we will have another episode of the Don't Split the Podcast Network of the DM's Deep Dive soon.
Yeah, cobaltpress.com.
Check out cobaltpress.com. See you, everybody.